Thank you so much for the welcome, Kim. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. I'm Amy. I'm super excited to nerd out on design systems with you all today. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right. So design system strategy and planning. It's a big topic and a complex one, and you'll probably get used to hearing from people in the design system space that it depends. And that is our favorite catchphrase because it's true. There are so many external, internal factors, just so many different facets to design that impact strategy and planning. So very excited to dive into this with you guys. Just a little disclaimer, I have had a cold, so pardon the sniffing, and if I'm reaching for a tissue, you know why. That said, let's go ahead and dive right into it. So I'm Amy. I am a senior product designer in the design system space at Therapy Brands, and also the mentor team lead here at IterateUX. And I did see in our group here, we have another one of our fantastic mentors who's joined all the way from Egypt on this call, Syed. He's also helping as a mentor in this UX challenge. I know some of you may be participating in the UX challenge and others may have joined externally. And so I'll try to hit both points here in this presentation from the UX challenge perspective, where some participants and teams have been tasked with working on a design system for one of the stakeholders, one of these companies. And then others of you may already be working on design systems or interested in working in design systems. So I'll try to cover all the bases there. I also do a lot of mentorship with University of Washington, their iSchool. I'm a mentor in their iMentorship program, and do a lots of workshops. So for my day job, I work in design systems at Therapy Brands, as we mentioned. That's in the healthcare space, and it's software as a service, practice management software for like mental health, behavioral, occupational rehabilitation, physical therapy. We have 13 different products. And I am shaping the new mindful design system where, many of our products have design systems, and this is kind of going to be the mothership design system as we move from a house of brands to a branded house concept. And let me move Zoom out of my way here. There we go. So my typical workday at Therapy Brands involves lots of communication and collaboration. This is absolutely key in the design system space. I'll be collaborating and communicating with designers, engineers, POs, upper leadership, and primarily I work on tokens, components, lots and lots of documentation, design system research, governance, and strategy. And at IterateUX, I serve as the mentor team lead, and I've provided mentorship for our UX challenges, one-on-one portfolio and resume reviews, lead workshops like this, and also focus on managing and growing our internal mentor team. And so for today's agenda, we're actually going to kick this off with a little whiteboarding activity, get to know each other, explore pains and gains in the design system realm, and then we'll dive into planning and research, design system strategy, documentation, and then follow up with Q&A. So with no further ado, Anna, if you wouldn't mind dropping the FigJam board link into the chat, that would be fantastic. And everyone, if you want to click on that link and go ahead and follow us over to our FigJam board, I'll go ahead and share that. So we'll start over here on the far left. You can see I've just dropped a little comment. I know we already kind of said hello and where we're from, but if you want to connect with other folks, feel free to drop a comment. You can find that up here in the top bar, add a comment, or just hit C on your keyboard to go ahead and drop that. You can include your LinkedIn link if you would like to connect with other people and a little intro about yourself. Um, just saying like who you are, what you do, where you work, what you're passionate about, whatever you like. Um, so I'll give folks a few minutes to do a bit of networking. And if you don't want to network, that's totally fine. You can jump right over to the design system panes. Um, so I've divided this into two sections. The first is design system pains, which is just your biggest design system related pain points, concerns, or areas of confusion. And I know for the UX challenge participants, this will be directly in relation to the design system that you're building. And for other folks, this could be, just really anything that is, confusing or difficult or unclear in the design system world. So you can go ahead and grab a sticky note and start dropping comments over there. And that's okay also if you don't have any design system pains. We also have design system gains, and you can do either or both. And for the gains, these are going to be your design system related wins and success stories, the things that make you happy, the things that have been successes for you. And you can grab a sticky note and just express yourself there. I'll go ahead and turn on a little bit of music here. And let's just give everyone like 5 minutes and I'll start the timer. We've got just about a minute left here to drop your sticky note, and then we'll read off some of them. All right, our timer just completed here. So did everyone get enough time to put their thoughts down on stickies? I'll take that as a yes, unless I hear otherwise. And I'll zoom into some of these. So we have built a whole product, then thank you and goodbye, being laid off. Another pain being getting buy-in from executives. And then restrictive and too much boundaries for some peers. Would you be willing to unmute and provide some details on what you mean by let's detach here?
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. I'll just jump in quickly. Just with the fact that, say, design system, it's a base component, right? Most of the things, I'm thinking of like text fields for an example here. And people say it's too restrictive. They can't do what they need to achieve with that. So they just detach, which for us, it's fine. But that builds that sort of like mindset around that, oh, whatever we get, we just detach and do our own stuff with. And then they create inconsistencies. And there's a lot of like pushback for certain peers. But I think it's all about education. Like once you get around that and you explain why certain things, it's just the basics and you can do what you want. And if you're collaborating and enhancing those components and it's fixing 100 things at once, that's the power of that, right? So that's, yeah, some of the stuff we faced over the last few years. That's always been a bit frustrating, but it's normal. It's part of that growing pain, I guess.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree. I think education goes a long way. For sure, you're on the nose here. The more that designers, like Figma changes at the speed of lightning, you know, even variables didn't exist 2 years ago. There's, you know, many of these things that change and we have to change and adapt with it. And if designers are not used to leveraging some of those functionalities, just don't know how. It's a very good opportunity for that education to help things just run smoother and have that consistency. Because yeah, detaching components could be a huge pain point in the design work. Then let's go over here to the games, and we have collaboration across many disciplines. Um, Design systems saving time, money, and bringing people together. Focus on way bigger design problems. And then efficiency. Yeah, these are some good pains and gains. And for anyone who's shy, feel free, like on your own time, you can note stuff here or make your own notes. And we can also answer any of your questions that aren't answered in this presentation in the Q&A as well. So let's go ahead and hop back over to the presentation and dig right into it. All right. So getting started here. So for successful design systems, like coming right in there with the communication and collaboration, education, just all of this, like we're humans, right? And we are collaborating and communicating with humans. And this is absolutely everything in design systems. I think people can easily buy into the myth that design systems are visual design work, that it's just UI. But the reality is it's people. Design systems are people. And you know, to me, this is the beauty of working in the design system space. Um, as well as, the struggle, right? And then we'll get into starting a system. When creating a design system, it's very important to follow like a system for your system. And this can really start with interviews, roadmaps, and interface inventories. So for roadmaps, this can really help you plan out, the work that needs to be done, the goals that you have, and then the timeline. And this is helpful for a tool to communicate with stakeholders, with management, as well as understanding as a team the work that needs to be done. These are just some basic tools. There's many, many tools. I've even seen folks use like FigJam or Figma for a roadmap tool, but Monday.com and Notion are commonly used by really small, lean teams, and can be a good option there, especially because they can be cheaper or free. That's definitely a selling point. And then Jira and Asana are typically used by more mature teams. And they're typically already using these for like sprint planning, for how all that development work, design work, the different tasks, the features, the epics. So your roadmap can often fit really nicely into that. At my company, we're actually using Azure DevOps and Jira, depending on the product. And the whole company is moving over into AHA, which is a very expensive road mapping tool. But I also had never heard of it until our company had decided to move in that direction. For the design system roadmap, these are just some little screenshots of like a roadmap with time estimations. Here you could, this is like an example of like conducting stakeholder interviews at the beginning, synthesizing interviews, defining those design principles, and you can time box that in like days, weeks, months, however this is looking. And this will feed into the more granular ticket for each one. So like say you have a 3-day project that is for your color system. This can be divided into smaller projects that can be time boxed, that could be like, an hour or a day. And, this could be things like creating the color swatch, defining the gray range, defining the pink range, things like this. But it's a very helpful tool, especially at the beginning, to decide like for this UX challenge. If you set your roadmap, this can really help. Okay, we have 6 weeks to get this project done. And in these 6 weeks, here's what we're going to get done week 1, and how we're going to divide out who takes which path, and divide that workload, communicate with our stakeholders, our timeline on getting this done. So that can be really helpful. And then of course, at the company level, we use this for communicating with upper management, aligning our team goals to business and organization goals. So it's a great tool to have from the beginning. And then diving into the design process, I think as UX designers, we're all familiar with this, like design thinking, double diamond, human-centered design, or even you may have your own process that you've come up with your own clever way of wording things and thinking about that design process. And it's really no different in the design system realm. Like we're going to start with that discovery, empathize, understand phase at the beginning. We're going to, proceed there into defining specific problems, and this is going to be very iterative. We may develop specific components and loop back to the discovery phase. Then
I forgot to ask you a question.
Oh yeah.
Do you want me to get you a ticket for the high holidays for Twirlings?
Oh, I'm sorry.
When are you going to buy it? I don't know. They haven't gone on sale yet.
May need to be muted here on the chat. Thank you. Yeah, so you'll proceed along this design process, and and it's very iterative in nature. So, it's not going to be this linear, like discover, define, develop, deliver. If you're following the design thinking, from empathize, understand, ideate, prototype, test, you can be looping back to earlier phases within that process, especially as you're building out components or developing that strategy. So here in that research phase where you're empathizing and understanding, one of those first questions you're going to ask is who are your users? So typically this will be your stakeholders, fellow designers, which could be UX or product designers, visual UI designers, content designers, engineering, your developers, product owners, product managers, and then also your end users. Larger teams may also have access to folks like accessibility specialists and UX writers and UX researchers as well. So these could also be users of the design system that are interacting and collaborating with you. In this IterateUX challenge context, you'll have your company stakeholders. This may be, the CEOs, the founders, the representative of that company, or potentially if you're even able to meet with some of their like design or development team and ask questions of them, any of those stakeholders from the company. And then you'll have your team, of course, your fellow designers. And then other stakeholders are going to be the judges and the mentors, right? People who are also advising you along your journey and ultimately, judging these projects when you're all done. So getting started with this empathize and understand, really, really recommend, if you haven't already, having those stakeholder and user interviews from the beginning. There's something when I joined my current company that I was very big on was meeting with all these different stakeholders in the company, the POs, the directors, the designers, the engineers, and understanding, what are the current struggles? How do they like to collaborate and work? What insights they can give, like understanding their perspective, their pain points, and what they like about the design system. Then we will have secondary research, which you may be familiar with as UX and product designers, competitive analysis, benchmarking, any secondary research study that you are doing online. And then component audit. So if this is like an existing product, you'll be wanting to inspect all these different components and figure out, where are those areas of inconsistency? Where do you want to be, and identify that gap. And then surveys are another really great way of understanding that space that you're in, the users that you're working with, whether these are, end users or internal users. And that's one of the things that I really love about design systems is that we have such easy access to our internal users. Like literally we work with them. Which is amazing. We don't have to wait weeks scheduling interviews and struggling to get access to those users. Of course, we also have our end users who are interacting with this like UI, the components within the products. And that's super important as well. But we are definitely leveraging those like internal and external users here. So for the stakeholder and user interviews, I compiled a few questions here. Like getting started, you're basically asking yourself, what do I need to know? So some questions could be like, how do stakeholders see this design system serving them and the teams using it? What is important to them? And then what problems will the design system solve? Who are you working with? Is it just your team, other teams too? How will work be divided? How is this whole organization and structure? Is there a team in place who will use this design system? Can you interview them? So this would be specifically for this UX challenge context. How awesome would this be to be able to interview the designers or the design system team who eventually would be using this product after you've created it and shipped it over to them? And then what already exists, existing like library, UI kits, designs, branding assets that you can access, any existing research that teams may have done. And, this can apply not only for the UX challenge context, but also just as folks working in product or design system space. Like when I came onto my new company, is very important for me to be able to know like what research has already been done. What do we have right now? Where are things at right now? What existing deliverables? What are the tools that we're currently leveraging? Because this all helps me put together a good strategy for like what I might recommend to change, where we're at right now, and how to build and move forward. And then what patterns do you need to make? Maybe there's like existing patterns, and maybe there's some that haven't been designed yet, but there's a need for. So then we have secondary research, which can be benchmarking and exploring the best design systems. And I love doing this specific secondary research because, sometimes you're wondering, where do I even start? And the first question I ask myself is, what are successful companies doing? What are other design system teams doing? And what are some of those like common patterns or considerations to leverage? So I'm showing you a few different, there's many open source design systems out there, but just showing you a few of the very popular ones. So of course, Google's Material Design. It has an interactive video like playing here. There's the sidebar that expands to the full navigation. And then there's IBM's Carbon Design. Here we can also see the side navigation with a bunch of drop downs. We can see things like about carbon, what's happening, and then designing, developing, contributing, these sort of like governance concepts that are here. And then elements, guidelines, components, patterns, all of this existing. So we start getting an idea of like, well, what should be in a design system? And then here's Atlassian's design system, and they don't have a side navigation, they have a top navigation, but we can see some of those similar things here with like getting started, brand, foundations, tokens, components, again, patterns, resources. We start seeing these, common themes, being able to search for things here. Then in Shopify's Polaris, we can see again, foundations, we're starting to see a theme here. Okay, foundations are part of a design system. We see design, content, again, patterns, components, tokens, icons, and they have a side nav as well. And then Eventbrite's Marmalade, they have a top navigation, which then expands into a side navigation. So here, when I've navigated into foundations, I can see that I have choices here for colors and typography. And I can also select from here on the screen. And then Microsoft's Fluent design system. Here I see that introduction, like getting started and some guidelines, and then of course components. And this, I've opened this here so you can see some of those components they have, common components. This is a great way to explore like maybe what components should our product have. Maybe there is an open source design system that you can reference that would have kind of similar use cases and components and guidelines and ways to reference, like how are they handling their documentation? What sort of components do they have if they are like a similar product to yours? And then here's Salesforce Lightning, again with that like side navigation here. And we can see that like introduction, what's new, getting started, and then similar, getting into design tokens and icons and components. And then Kiwi.com's Orbit design system. Get started as a big CTA right here. And then we have a top navigation with foundations, components, tokens. You're starting to get the idea of like what's in a design system. I really like that they've called out accessibility, really like front and center. Some design systems you kind of have to dig for that, but they've made it clear that that's a priority for them. And then you could reference components and patterns like very easily here. And my favorite resource is Design Systems for Figma. It's literally designsystemsforfigma.com. And I'll be sharing a big resource list with you after this workshop. And and this is one of the resources on there. This is literally a collection of all the open source design systems. You can search it, you can filter it, and you can just browse to your heart's content, like all these different design systems beyond even what I've showcased here. So next we have the component audit or inventory, it can be called either way, and that gap analysis. So if you have an existing product, once you've conducted an audit of the components that are existing, it's very important to consider that gap analysis to identify the gap that is between what currently exists and then where we would like these components, this product to go. If you don't have an existing product, then you're literally building from the ground up. And you may have like a different approach depending on, you know, is your product online and are these components and can you inspect them? Or, you know, do you just have design files? That's okay too. You can still compare designs for consistency and then propose where you would like that to be as you align with your stakeholders. And this is just an example of component audit and gap analysis for some projects that I worked on. And so for the component audit, I just included some details here that you can use your Chrome Dev Tools to be able to inspect the different states of components that are online. So any product, like you can go to Airbnb, for example, and literally right click and inspect. Or you can go into the browser to go into those dev tools and inspect, and you can select component states and review all those really helpful details on like what's actually the hex color here. Are there inconsistencies with the hex colors being used on your buttons? What is the text size? Well, you can inspect all those details, which is really great. If you don't have a product that's like living out in the wild, you can still do that with your design files. Like any design files and assets that you can get your hands on from, you know, Figma files, you can compare just directly there in Figma what these different, you know, text size, color, all of this that you can compare here. So a way to do this would be to like show a screenshot of that design. So in this case, it's like buttons, icons, things like this. And you can include like the name, the state. So, you know, maybe you have like the default state, the hover state, the focus state, and then descriptive usage of the component and the current context. So like what page is it living on? What is the purpose for this component? And then for the gap analysis, you could showcase like the changes that you would want to make. So like in this case, we see some changes for the toggle and active focus state. And I included documentation on like there's different sizes depending on the page that you're on, or if this is like mobile versus desktop, where for all the rest of the components, there's a uniform size. So my recommendation was like, let's have a uniform size across board for this component. And then, you know, focus state, how we want this to be for like, if something is like active versus focus. So just some examples there. Here's another one for like your input fields place. So this one is like with the current, again, this is Airbnb, where the placeholder and the label are existing inside. And then, you know, the desired or proposed solution, bringing those labels up top rather than existing inside the component and, you know, reducing the height of that box. Another way of conducting research here is surveys. And this can be a really nice, quick way to get insights, especially if you struggle with teammates or stakeholders not having the time to meet with you, or you want to just collect some quantitative data to understand like the health of your design system or some current pain points. It can be like a really quick, simple way to just put something together, send it out to the different users of your design system, and then get really valuable insights to take action on. And then for discovery, so now that you've done all this research, secondary surveys, interviews, component audits, and like really understood that space that you're in, what did you learn? What did you find? Did you have your assumptions challenged or validated? Maybe had them both, challenged and validated. And then how this helped you to define the problems and identify the desired outcomes and potential solutions that you want to pursue. So for defining, this can be all kinds of different deliverables and steps. So this can be from like using your research to define your personas, defining the naming conventions that you need for your components, for your tokens, defining the foundations that you're going to have, your accessibility guidelines, of course, the identified components that you have and then maybe that you want, the Figma file organization, how as a team you think makes sense for your file to be organized, defining your documentation approach. You know, is this going to be documentation at the Figma component level? Are you going to have external documentation? Are you working with developers? Do you have like Storybook or some kind of dev documentation as well? And then, you know, synthesizing your insights and key findings, creating an analysis. You can use tools that we use all the time as UX designers for like affinity mapping and clustering. Even like empathy maps and user journey maps can be super beneficial in defining what's going on, taking all those insights from like interviews and surveys, and then analyzing them and turning them into an action plan that you can take action on. So user personas in design systems can be part of this definition. And I love user personas because I think when you work in a design space and you're like, oh, designers are using this, it can be easy to design with yourself in mind instead of understanding that we all work very differently. We all think differently. It's not just designers using this, or if you are someone who does both design and code, maybe you're like front end engineer, you know, still, just because you can design and code doesn't mean that you understand what it's like for everyone or for the specific personalities on the team that you're working on. So I love using those research insights to create and inform and create personas. And we have internal users, which commonly, you know, this can be like the founder or the CEO in the context of this design challenge. This could be very different in the context of a company where it could be like, you know, directors, still could be like a CEO, but then you'll have your product owners, you'll have, of course, your designers and your developers, and those are all your internal users. And then you also have the external, like end users, and those will be like, once this product is built, all those components, all that UI, all those interactions that you designed, that is going to be interacted with by those end users. So you have the folks like using your design system and then the folks interacting with your design system within the product. And then the fun part, getting into the design and ideation. So this will be the information architecture of like your Figma file, defining those tokens and foundations, building components, documentation, prototyping, all that fun stuff. And I want to be aware of time here, so I'll kind of skip a bit through this. So this is a design system at one of my previous companies, and it was an FCP, which is like organized as foundation component pattern. So you can see here that there's like a bunch of different libraries. And one of them is like basic, which would be like your foundations. And if we take a peek into that file here, you can see how that basics is organized with like style guide, colors, typography, logo, buttons, cards, etc. You can see here some of those text styles that were created. So this is one example. This was another design system that I built working at a design agency, and this was for an enterprise white labeled design system. Similarly here, we can see, you know, like components to integrate. That was like a page for planning. Then some of those foundations, color, elevation, typography, themes, layouts, stuff like this, and then getting into those main components like, accordion, card, button, things like that. And you can see the text styles presenting a little differently here, where we had slash naming conventions and organizing them according to, like body, headline, purpose, and things like this. And this is the current design system that I'm working on, and it's very much in its baby phase. But some differences you'll notice here are that we do have, like the status legend, notes and planning, accessibility guidelines, foundations and components are separated, but we also have statuses for like something that's not yet existing versus something that's in progress. And you can also see that new ready for dev feature on display there, as well as, some of these different styles, the grid styles, the elevation, the typography. So just some different ways you can like organize the file. And then for foundations, these can be things, like your colors, your text styles, your grid styles, your elevation, icons, logos, just all that fun stuff. Then we have styles versus variables. So for that strategy, deciding what approach is best for you, it can depend on like the size of your product that you're working on. But some differences here is that variables are, for colors, are represented by a square in Figma, where styles are a circle. So those are some easy ways to visually track it. And then I always recommend variables as an approach, just because it's more scalable and saves time if and when you ever do want to theme your design system or start semantically aliasing your different colors and like organizing all of that, maybe using Token Studio and stuff like that. So it really sets up your design system better for scalability. But some products are very, very simple and have really basic colors and don't ever need variables because of how they function. So there are some products that styles will work just fine for, and it's important to be aligned with your team, with your company, on what approach is best for you. Some naming conventions for the primitives, which is kind of where those variables will start out at. We have those raw values that will then name as primitive colors. And this is an example of like white, your F 6 times. You could be calling it like gray -100. You could spell that different ways. You could call it gray 10, neutral 100. You could abbreviate that different ways. So all of this, just what's important is to align as a team. Like, have a little workshop, decide what makes sense to you, what you like, what's difficult maybe for people. Some people may struggle with abbreviations. Others may want things, find that if things are spelled out, it's unnecessarily long and difficult for them. But you can see here how this translates, like whatever approach you decide upon, that will translate over here into those color variables, which then you have like gray, 100, 200, 300, etc. And then tokens are super important in the planning. They are the building blocks of our design systems. And ultimately, they're a really nice way for us to be able to communicate, especially between the design and dev. And they're going to represent the literally smallest, most atomic design decisions that are making up that design system's visual style. And then aliasing will be that process of converting those foundations, the very primitive values, into something that's more scalable. So for naming conventions that are semantically aliased, these are just a bunch of different approaches you can have. You can have the object role variant, the BEM, which is the block element modifier, just state-based, scale-based, all kinds of different ways. And again, this is just good to align as a team on how, if you are semantically aliasing, these color tokens in your design system, or even non-color tokens in your design system, how are you going to call that? Pink 700 is going to be what's referenced, by button color primary, or do you want it a functional use case, which can be like color feedback error. So like the feedback is what is demonstrating and communicating like the feedback mechanisms or states or things like this. And then you have your state-based naming convention pictured here, where we have that like hover background color. But there's so many different ways to approach this. So if you are choosing to semantically alias your tokens, definitely like workshop it as a team, get aligned on what makes sense so that you don't have inconsistencies in your design system. And then these are just some examples of like an Airbnb redesign that I did, and some of those color tokens as primitives versus how they look semantically alias, where we can see like background default, label default, border default, these different ways, and then like the light mode and the dark mode, and you can see how they are referencing color neutral gray 400, color neutral gray 600, for example, and really setting that up for scalability. And then these are dimensions, which I know we've talked a lot about color, but we also have dimensions, which can be like spacing, border radius, like padding, margin, all that fun stuff. So these are like those primitive dimensions, and then semantically aliasing that with like BR standing for border radius, P standing for padding, and referencing, you know, dimension 1, dimension 4, whatever those are. So this is like another way that you can semantically alias, or even just go with your primitives to have those set up. Then, of course, we probably are all familiar with Brad Frost's atomic design, you know, starting with atoms, the smallest little bit, that will be like, you know, your tokens, molecules, organisms, and even into templates and pages as you're like expanding these components, moving from something that's like a tiny design decision to something bigger, to something compound, and eventually becoming like, you know, your wireframes. And this is just a design example of that, where you can see like an atom being like a really simple design element, molecules starting to combine different atoms within them, and then organisms combining different molecules, and then templates putting like all of this together, and eventually that template, you know, will fit on a page. So you can kind of see that at a design level. And then something I'm very fond of to enhance design system work is prototyping at the component level. And this can save designers so much time in having like hover interactions or focus interactions, like however you are building this in. You can also provide documentation for these animations in your like component level specs, which is super helpful. And this is just a little screenshot of like what that looks like at the component level if you haven't done component level animations. And then we have component level documentation. This is for the mindful design system that I'm working on right now. And I was documenting behavior for the helper text on like how it should truncate, punctuation for it, all these details. And this is an example on the left of how that looks in the design, where they would be able to reference this wherever the designers are using an instance of this component. They'll have that component level documentation there to guide them. Here's the spacing, you know, if it's a tooltip, it should always be 8 pixels of spacing away from an element, and they don't have to go and look up documentation because it's right there in their space for them. And then in dev mode for the developers, where that documentation can live as well. So it's really nice that it translates for both sides. And then we have like beyond our internal documentation, which would be like Figma, our reference site, external documentation platforms. One that I would highly recommend for the UX challenge is Figmayo, because it can literally take a Figma project, and if you have your design system just in one file, it's free. And it will literally just read it and translate it into a platform similar to those ones that I was showing you before. There's a little bit of a learning curve in learning how to like name things and use it so it visualizes the way you want. But it's a super cool to learn, and something really valuable to like hand over to a company that like, here's, you know, the Figma designs and a reference site. But there's also other very robust external platforms. My company is in the process of moving from Confluence to Zero Height right now. There's also Supernova. Storybook is also where we have some of our documentation on the dev side. And so this is like our signature capture component in Confluence right now and what some of that documentation looks like. And then over on the storybook side, the same component and what that looks like there with like a sandbox. And then we have governance and contribution models, which I put at the end here, but I think it's great to have these discussions early on because this can help to identify like those key players, the process you're going to use and understand those structures. But you can also approach this as the design system matures because this can also be common that your contribution or governance models will need to adjust just as the company changes or things shift. And so these are kind of the three main types of governance models that we have in design systems. And for the UX challenge context, you're most likely here in centralized, which is basically where you're a dedicated core design system team here, creating and maintaining the design system components and then pushing out externally to the product teams. And this is really common for like design agencies building a design system and then building that for a client, for example. And then there's the federated model, which can be a common approach where basically there is no design system team, but all the product designers contribute to the design system. And it can work really well for some companies, but there are also some limitations where like if no one's time is dedicated to the design system fully, then sometimes the design system won't move very fast, or you don't have someone who is specializing in that space knowing how to make judgment calls, struggling with that whole time balance. And my favorite is the hybrid model, which combines federated and centralized and makes for compensating for the drawbacks of both. And again, if it doesn't work well or it's not managed well, then it's just not going to work well. But it's this combination where like you can have a federated committee that provides direction and feedback, and then a centralized team creating those UI libraries, coded components. So that would be similar to like how my company is doing things. The core design system team is me on the design side and our front end engineer on the development side, and we work very closely together. But there's also contributions from product, from the design team, from other developers and leadership. And then this is just a flow that I recently put together for our contribution model. Whoops. Go back here. There we go. For our contribution model, which is highlighting that flow of like how components can get contributed by product owners, designers, developers, leadership, anyone in the company, and how that collaborative process will be between design and dev, like QAing the component, testing it, of course, creating it beforehand, and then eventually how that's going to get shipped and used by the different products. And then I'll just wrap up with a quote here, which is design systems are like homes and Lego projects, always a work in progress. Like literally the definition of done is never done, which can be really fun if you're like me and enjoy that challenge of just constant challenge. And I know we're like coming up on time here, but turn it over next to Q&A if anyone has any questions or wants to chat about anything.
Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing your expertise on the design systems. So we have several questions, and the first one's coming from Bai. So how did you, I think this is regarding to one of the few slides in the beginning. So how did you decide on each quotation marks epic?
I'm sorry, can you repeat this one?
Yeah. So how did you decide on each quotation marks epic?
Decide on each epic? I mean, it has depended on, how you are structured as a team. For example, I've worked at very small startups where the design team is the one putting together the epic. So we do get to make that decision of like, okay, you know, the epic is going to be, I'm trying to think, like I'm getting so distracted from my own thoughts. The epic can be, you know, say the design system itself, and then the features can exist within it, say as like the different components, or you can have it even more granular, where, you know, the design system may or may not be the epic, like depends on the tool that you are using. Um, if you're working with a larger company, you know, you're probably going to be having these conversations with products on how this is going to get aligned, because there can be very different structures in like how they're going to see things. Like, is it an epic? Is it an initiative? What tools you are using? Um, like, even it's really funny to me coming from a Jira background and now using ADO, the Azure DevOps, like bugs and prod defects, like they can be called different things, and like task versus user story, you know, how people are referring to things. So really aligning with those partners and figuring out like, well, what makes sense to them. Again, it kind of comes to that like, well, it depends in design systems, because that's exactly what it is. It depends on who you're collaborating with. You know, are you a small scrappy team, or is this going to be design led, where you get to decide what makes sense to you as like the epic. And for anyone on the call who isn't familiar with this, the epic would be kind of that like larger, if you will, project level. And beneath it will be like the features. And then beneath that can be like user stories or a task. Like, and again, depending on the platform you're using, they're called different or structured different. Um, but it's basically, you know, figuring out how you're going to organize the work and where it fits. Because like in a startup, you may have like many epics, and the design system is just one of them, where you're having like other epics that can be related to, you know, the feature work that you're working on, and how the design system is going to align, and those components will feed into that feature work. I hope that helps. It depends, never helps.
Thank you for your answer. And we have another one from Mai. And so what methods do you use for component audits and gap analysis? Are there any templates available for reference?
Ooh, that's a good question. I've not used a template, but there probably is. I feel like anytime I go onto Figma community, it's amazing what folks have put together. And if I do find something, I'll add it to our resource PDF. But I've not used a template. The way I've usually just laid that out is as a single page in Figma, where I will take my screenshot, like say and I'll organize it by component. So I'll have buttons, and this will literally be like screenshots of every button, primary, secondary, tertiary, like specific action buttons. If you have multiple products, you're also comparing them against the different products. Then the different states, hover, focus, active, you know, press, all of these different interactions, comparing the different sizes that you have for them. And I'll take screenshots of those dimensions when I go into like inspect, if this is like a living product, or if I only have, say, no components. Like sometimes I've come into projects where there's literally not a design system, no components, they're just design frames. So lots of inconsistency, right? But you can still take those, you know, copy those frames and compare the different sizes and colors and everything. And then I'll just list that out and kind of make a grid of, you know, the notes that I want to make for it, of like inconsistency of size, or like it's using this typography for these buttons, but a totally different size or totally different typography or font for a different button. And then for the gap analysis, that's kind of that next step, which can get into the ideation, right? Because the first step is just the component audit. And sometimes we can jump into ideation right there, where you're already like, oh my God, like, no, this is terrible. This is not a good practice. And you're dropping the comments in the file. But then when you get into ideation, that's where you might be building your own component set. and making recommendations, which then you would want to use that gap analysis to communicate with your different like product or design partners and make sure you're getting alignment, that it's not just, I suggest we should make this really big change to make sure that we have some consistency here on these components, but you're making sure that like the designers are aligned and are aware of it, product is aware of it.
Again, just like that communication and collaboration. But I feel like that comes a little bit later once you start actually exploring, ideating on, well, here's what we have and how do we translate like all these different inconsistencies. And a lot of times these are like further discussions that you have to have, which when you realize you have like 4 different font sizes and 2 different font types, you have to sit down with the team and decide which one do we want. And sometimes that can be easy where you're like, oh, these are inaccessible. We're using like 10 pixels. So obviously like we want 16 pixels for accessibility. Some of these will be like easy calls to make a recommendation, where others can get really like nitty gritty and into preference or into like how you're defining that visual identity.
That was a great answer. Thank you so much, Evie. And then we have last one from Bai. What's the relationship between Storybook and the design system?
Oh, this is a great question. So Storybook is primarily managed at my company by our front-end engineer. And I interact with it constantly throughout the day, but I don't like build things out in it. It's very much, it's not only a cool tool for documentation, but also for our engineers to store like their code excerpts and documentation and to have that like workshop playground. So like in Figma, unless you build a prototype, you're not able to see how the component behaves. But in Storybook, because it's coded directly in there, you have this collaboration with the developers where they're able to go in, designers can go in and inspect, but you also can play around with it. So if you're a product owner, you can go in and hover on a button and watch it change its color. And you can watch the interactions. You can click on something and watch the pop-up come up. So you kind of have this like a code sandbox where you can preview and understand how components are working in the wild, which is something that a lot of people can't do very well in Figma. Like you can build out your prototypes, but still a lot of product folks won't be familiar with using Figma. And unless you provide them with a prototype link, they won't know how to go into Figma and see your component like in action. And then also, from the development side, to be able to like inspect that code, get all the information they need, and then have that cross documentation. So from our Storybook, we have cross documentation references to our Confluence, where we have a lot of like design and usage guidelines, do's and don'ts, examples of how the component is living in the wild. So like, here's the component, and now here's where it lives like on the schedule page, or here's how it lives, in client details or something like this. We can define the responsive guidelines, all that. So in Storybook, there will be links to like our Confluence documentation, and then also to the Figma designs and the Figma specs. So when developers come in, they can find exactly what they want. When product owners come in, they can find exactly what they want. So it's like that landing pad or dashboard where when someone has a question of like, we need something, where do I find it? They hop onto Storybook, they look at like what we have, and then they figure out, do I need to make a request for a new component or a change to a component? Will this serve our use case? What are those constraints? They'll have those conversations with us, but then also they can look up like all that documentation we've provided to sometimes, answer their own questions just by looking at the documentation and specs.
Sounds like a really amazing tool. Our next one's from Kevin. And actually, Kevin, I'll let you feel free to unmute yourself, and we would love to say hi.
All right, my daughter's probably gonna jump in. So yeah, she's my design assistant here.
It's
my
so
biggest
cute. I keep getting distracted with her. I'm like, oh, baby.
There's always been the fact that, yeah, as you evolve over time, right, there's more like people adopting the design system. But what we find that was really challenging over time was, well, if it's multi-brand on top of that, like it added extra variables and challenges. But it was always the fact that design was not quick enough to be up with code, and code at times was not like in sync with design. So what was that real source of truth, like in that case specifically? So it all depended on which department, which silo we were like supporting and servicing. But what should be the right like way around that? I'm not even sure there's still one, to be honest. Like which one you prefer? Obviously, we're all designers, but at times I saw like components being built from an engineering perspective first, which was really great because it's stuff we didn't really factor in as designers, and vice versa. So as you said, it's a cross collaboration. It goes hand in hand, but when the teams are getting bigger and bigger, and that's when it gets out of hand, like what should be the right approach around that? Design or code as our source of truth, you think?
In my opinion, code is always the source of truth because design's an idea, it's a concept, but it doesn't live anywhere. Like it doesn't actually exist. And I know this like sounds rude to designers. They're like, no. And this was actually, fascinating when I come onto companies. So like for me, I've mentioned this because I've been at my current company for 3 months. So like all this is like very fresh, right? Those questions I asked, like when I met with the design team, what's the source of truth? Figma. And then when I met with the developers, storybook, code. Like I think that's the biggest thing is to have the alignment from all the teams on what is the source of truth. Like what should it be? And then how to properly document something that isn't. Because in all reality, Storybook is where we have our live, real components that developers can use and they can implement within the product. And then the designs might not match those because either something got developed first, which can happen. We use MUI. So we have that ability, out of the box, something could be developed without design having had much of a say. And so, enhancing that collaboration and just I feel like this can be a workshop in and of itself, but fostering those good working relationships, solid working relationships with your partners, like being human, find out what they like, what their hobbies, like when they're going to want to collaborate with you, and see you as a human will make that workflow work a lot better. I feel like so many of the problems that existed even at my company, so previously it was federated. There was no design system team. So it was all the product designers not having much time and trying to contribute when they could. That's why I was brought on. And a lot of those problems you see that like, oh, when you collaborate, when you see fellow humans as humans and get to know them, they're going to be excited for like how you're helping them because they know how it was a struggle before. And so, I've discovered that there's enhanced collaboration where now it's not very common for something to get developed before design has had input because the engineers will reach out to me and ask me for input. And, if there is something where they have to proceed, they'll at least get some verbal or, some kind of collaboration where there's alignment with design. We can make our notes and our documentation from our side. Maybe we have a page and, we're documenting that like this lives in code, but we don't have Figma designs for it yet. And we need to match those to code. And then sometimes that means later on, you discover what got developed might not be quite how you want to visually align things. So you're submitting tickets, for an enhancement. Let's change, the border radius to this or the color to this. So there's ways to continue that collaboration if something is built prior in code. And then in terms of, that misalignment, if things are built in designs, but not up to spec in code, again, it's logging those bugs, those prod defects, QAing, that was a big thing for me was getting looped into our QA process with the engineers because it was kind of a struggle of like design QA, it was seen as like, well, engineers QA, from this like very back end mindset, but it's so beneficial for design to also come in and be able to catch those things. So instead of having to log a product defect later on, we can catch that while it's still in development before it's released. And I've seen even some designers use the Figma component level documentation as a way to mark component status of like, it exists in like this has been developed, or this has been, this has not been one way or the other. I actually did that recently with a badge component because we have a basic badge, but for some future refresh brand work coming up, we're going to have like a colored variant, and it doesn't exist yet, but we have designs for it. So I marked at the Figma component level, so when designers are using these, they don't accidentally grab something and then use it in a design when it's not ready to be coded, because we don't want that confusion and handoff. Why am I seeing this badge that we don't have yet? We don't want to miscommunicate. So I have like the Figma component level documentation that states, this, here's that it's slated for Q4 work. These do not live in the wild yet, all these details that we need to have there. So that can like really help with that. But again, it all just comes into that like communication, collaboration, and there's so much of it. I feel like, many days you spend so much of your time just having conversations, but honestly, that's like what drives good workflows and prevents having just that frustration of like, you hear about the conflict between design and dev, and it doesn't have to be that way. Like if you make yourself ready and available and open and you're there to help, people are going to love that. And of course there are the outlying special personalities or like I think we've all had those particular like hard struggles or ways that we've needed to focus on specific teams or folks, but in general, just seeing folks as human and presenting yourself as being available and there to help, and that design system go-to person, they'll want to collaborate with you too. And then identifying those areas that it's like, this isn't clear, oh, this was a problem, what can I do to then fix it? And sometimes that's having a workshop or a design critique with the team on like how we can improve these things. But it's, yeah, the definition of done is never done. It's like so ongoing, and the struggles is like it's real. Actually, there's I don't know if you've heard of the podcast webinar by Zero Height. It's called Design Systems WTF. And Luke and Michelle literally like spend this time talking about like the problems in the design system space. And it's like such a nice vent sesh, as well as, sometimes a solution is reached, and other times you just realize, yeah, we're just all acknowledging that like these are problems, these are struggles, and no one has the answer yet. But totally like recommend that podcast. And it's like a live webinar, so they're on video and you can like join or like listen to the recordings later. But yeah, it can be very validating.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we have one last question from Manasi. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. So what do you recommend a startup with level 1 UX maturity go about creating a design system? We have a UI kit. Should a designer be designing new components in Figma files instead of having one standard design system library that gets referenced?
So is anything living in code yet? Or it's just at the Figma library?
It's coded. Yeah, it's coded. We have a UI kit. We are starting to build a design system, and I have a designer on my team. We used to reference the UI kit, and it was the source of truth. All the components lived there. Even if you add a new one, it would get added to that UI kit. But now he's been creating new components in each file, and I don't know whether to like stop him, encourage him to do what. So I need to know like the best practices around like design systems.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends, because it's going to come down to the resources that you have to throw at it. and that's going to determine like the tools, you know, the staffing, all of that. So sometimes that can be a constraint. If you're looking for like an external design system to live as like open source or be that reference, because like I understand, you know, a lot of folks, especially at the startup level, you start with Figma being that like source of truth until stuff gets coded. And then you realize, oh, there's so many people struggling to understand how to use Figma or knowing where to go in Figma. We need something that's like works for people better, right? So I really recommend that Figma as like a starting point, because you can get it for free if you have like one file, and it can be like a nice test, because if you say you spend the designers spend the time to do Figma component level documentation, when you like press the magic button in Figma and generate that design system from your Figma file into Figma, it will bring your documentation, it will bring everything, and then you can continue to customize it there. Now, if you have like multi-products, multi-brand, stuff like that, you start looking at like needing to pay. And it, you know, it goes up and up and up, depending if you're like enterprise, you can end up paying, you know, several thousand a year. Or something smaller can just be, you know, like 24 a month or something like this, but it can be a good starting point for having that. But if you're even looking for something free, I've seen people use stuff like Notion for, you know, this will be very manual, right? Because you're not going to be able to just say, here's my design system's name, here's the URL, press a button, and now make small adjustments. You know, you're going to have to like really upkeep the documentation. And that's the cool thing about Figma is that like when you make documentation changes at the Figma component level, all you'll have to do is like press that button again and get that to like re-upload. And it can be a good way to get that, you know, started off, especially if you're looking to not pay too much. There's also different price points, like depending on if you have, you know, SSO or what kind of security, privacy, what team size and how much money you have to throw at it. You can always book a call with like Zero Height, Supernova, any of these folks. And a lot of times they have like a free plan that you can play around with. And there will be some limitations to that. And again, it will depend like how much time does your designer or your developers have to like throw at this? Like, what are your resources? How much can you pay? How much time will be invested? When I joined my company, I conducted some competitive analysis on these different platforms. And we had demos from all these different companies, put together this competitive analysis to figure out, you know, the price point, the offerings. You know, something that stood out with Zero Height for us was it had versioning. It could integrate with Microsoft Teams. Collaboration was built directly into the platform itself. So I wouldn't have to use an external form or external way of like people wanting to contribute to that design system. So that's, you know, we decided as a team, engineering and design, on pursuing Zero Height, but you know, budget was also part of that. So that's why it's in process. It's falling into Q1 2025 budget. So, you know, all this can be considerations. So I think you know, figuring out like what is your budget and then conducting some of that competitive analysis can be a good starting point. Or even just exploring, you know, with limitations, like what do we have at our disposal now? Like when I joined the company, we had Confluence as a tool that's, you know, included in our suite of products with like Atlassian. So the design system was documented in Confluence, and this is super manual. You know, anytime anything needs to change, it's literally like typing it in by hand, editing, you know, deleting the screenshot, adding a new image. You know, this is not like sustainable over time. And also it doesn't support like versioning. It doesn't support code, you know, lots of limitations there, but it was, you know, what was at the disposal of the company in the early days. So yeah, I hope that helps. I know it's like another, it depends what you have for resources and staffing.
That was great. Thank you.
Mhm.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Amy. I think that was all of our questions. Thank you so much, Amy, for such an insightful presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming and for your great questions. This was fantastic.
Yes, thank you so much, Amy, for being our speaker today, and everyone here who joined us. We'll see you next week.